Walter Molino was born in the northern Italian town of Reggio nell'Emilia in 1915, but he relocated with his family to Milan, and a few years later he enrolled at the city's university. I can find no record of what he was actually studying, but it was while there that he began having cartoons published in the university's newspaper. In 1934, and still not yet 20, Molino made his debut as a poster designer with this image of a stylish young couple, and 2 years later he also started working regularly for the humour magazine Bertoldo with what would become a long-running series of sketchy line drawings, which appear to have been created with a combination of graphite pencil and charcoal or Conte crayon. In the second half of the decade he also began working on comic strips, the earliest of which was Zorro of the Metropolis, the heroic exploits of a masked vigilante, but not the better-known Mexican swordsman. It only managed a run of less than a year, and although Molino created another comic strip, Virus, the Wizard of the Dead Forest, with the writer Federico Pedrocchi, it too only enjoyed a similarly brief existence. But in the same year he also created his second poster, this jolly and technically accomplished painted image for an Italian comedy film. Less happily, it was also in 1939 that the Second World War began, and somewhat predictably Mussolini's fascist government chose to be allied with Hitler's Germany. Molino would have been 24 years old when the war began, but it seems that for some reason he wasn't called up to fight for his country. Despite his far from prestigious track record as a strip artist to date, Molino persevered and created several more in the early 1940s, some of which did perform better than his earliest efforts. Among these was 1941's Dynamiter, a character who was the main subject of a comic of that name. Meanwhile, Bertoldo continued to be a mainstay of his early career, and he carried on producing more humour for its pages. And although some of it remained as light-hearted and inconsequential as it had been a few years earlier, these grainy monochrome and duotone cartoons also increasingly took swipes at the Allies and their leaders. Even so, compared to what his more fanatical contemporaries in Germany were creating at this time, they were far from vitriolic in their mockery, and mercifully never anti-Semitic. Bertoldi magazine called its day in 1942, but there was no shortage of other work for Molino, and he created the humorous cartoon character Pin Focoso for the children's comic Corriere dei Piccoli. He also illustrated the covers of women's romance novels, which were published monthly during the years of the war. But most significantly for his career, it was at this time that he started to feature with increasing regularity in the popular magazine La Domenica del Corriere, including full-colour images on their covers. To date, the magazine's covers have been exclusively illustrated by Achille Beltrame, an illustrator featured in Unsung Heroes of Illustration 96, who had been with the magazine since 1900 but who was now slowing down in preparation for retirement. So it was only natural that in the years of the war both he and Molino created covers and monochrome painted interior page illustrations which featured the battles of World War II, including some fanciful reimaginings of events to literally paint the Italian military forces as either more victorious than they actually were or heroically defeated by the Allies and their brutal aggression as a form of softcore domestic propaganda. Italy surrendered to the Allies in late 1943, even though Mussolini wasn't eventually executed until 1945, and from this point on Molino's images for La Domenica reflected the Italians' change of heart. Unfortunately, Achille Beltrame missed out on his planned retirement by dying in 1945. It was also in 1945 that Molino found a new home for the more comedic side of his output, with another magazine titled Gong. All his work for this magazine was monochrome, but rendered with tonally applied paint and printed in grayscale with surprising clarity. And virtually all of these images demonstrated his facility for only slightly exaggerated human anatomy and posing, with a particularly accomplished approach to the creation of shapely, provocative females. His relationship with Gong appears to have endured for only a few years, but in that time he produced some of his finest and most expressive humorous work. It was also at this time that he started to contribute to another briefly popular humour magazine, Candido, with some jokes created with the sketchier graphite technique he'd used for Bertoldo. With the end of the war, the favoured subject matter of La Domenica returned to a mix of sport, current affairs, and the publication of a large number of images which were records of disasters both major and minor, all approached with an obvious overblown relish by Molino. And it was this most sensational aspect of his output which became massively popular with the magazine's readers and consolidated his profile as one of Italy's leading illustrators. It seems the Italian public had an insatiable appetite for his frequently lurid, disaster-obsessed images, and Molino appears to have been only too happy to oblige them with a collection of dynamically composed dramatic moments featuring as much exaggerated peril and destruction as could be imagined. A year later he also collaborated for the first time with the weekly magazine Salgari, named for the author Emilio Salgari, who, although he had died in 1911, was still revered as a writer of adventure and science fiction stories. And Molino's strip images, which had by now become considerably more sophisticated, brought them to visual life in colour for Salgari's readers for the next 5 years or so. Among his earlier monochrome comic strip efforts had been the swashbuckling Capitan Laudace, which was also revisited with colour printing at this time and enjoyed similar popularity. As the 40s came to a close, it continued to be his generally riotous work for La Domenica which dominated Molino's output, and the visual evidence suggests he was always trying to outdo himself with more spectacular scenes of destruction and humans in peril. But despite his commitment to the magazine as the 50s began, he also returned at least to an extent to the production of posters for a range of clients, some of which played to his strengths with portrayals of attractive young females. In addition to his already formidable workload, he also started another enduring relationship with the newly launched women's weekly Grand Hotel. Molino was one among others who contributed romantic covers featuring attractive couples in any number of blameless pursuits. But the real source of his enduring popularity in this magazine was his series of melodramatic picture stories in comic strip format, known in Italian as cine romanze. He created these with ink and monochrome washes, and they were populated by unnamed but easily recognisable popular stars from the big screen, most of them American. Grand Hotel and Molino's contributions proved to be particularly popular with the female readers of the magazine, but not quite so much with the Catholic Church, which frequently denounced the racy content of the magazine in no uncertain terms. From this distance it's hard to imagine just what the Vatican had such a problem with, given there was no overt sexual activity. But their disapproval only served to fan the flames of the magazine's popularity and of Molino's reputation. It was also in the 1950s that he was commissioned to create romantic cover images for the French magazine Nudeur, owned by the publishers of Grand Hotel. And in terms of their subject matter and execution, they were virtual clones of those created for the Italian publication. And although all this other magazine work must have occupied a lot of Molino's time and energy, the 1950s was a decade which continued to be dominated by his commitment to La Domenica. And it was obvious from the many others he created during the decade that he and the readers continued to be happiest when he was conveying some form of physical energy, and in particular his evocations of yet more disasters. All Molino's work, but particularly this aspect of it, rather begs the question of what he might have used as reference to create these complex and very subject-specific images. Predictably, I found no record of his working methods, so speculation is the best I can manage. Firstly, there's the question of whether he was using life models, and if so, how did he get them to pose as if falling out of an aeroplane or being crushed by an oncoming train? And then there were the scenes themselves, which by their very nature he could not just have been waiting around with his pencil poised for disaster to strike. So I can only assume he relied on journalistic photography and a large amount of imagination. And as these events were in the main current at the time of publication, he must have also worked very fast in order to meet the short deadlines. Whatever his methods, you have to admire the exaggerated reality and vivacity of all his illustrated work. In 1955, Molino was commissioned along with others to help complete an edition of Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, following the death of the original illustrator Gino Boccasile a couple of years earlier. The complete series ran to 100 colour illustrations, but how extensive Molino's contribution was I've been completely unable to find out, and the images I'm showing may or may not have been his work. Otherwise, his commitment to La Domenica and obsession with cataclysmic and catastrophic scenarios remained undiminished, although he did include occasional more sedate and less sensational images referring to current affairs and politics. It was also in the 1960s that he produced a collection of caricatures in the magazine, although some of these were of Italian figures and therefore not widely recognised elsewhere. But the more internationally recognisable celebrities were certainly executed with considerable prowess, so we can assume the same was true of the others. It was around this time that Molino took on yet another magazine client in the form of the French cinema and entertainment magazine Festival. He created another enduring and immensely popular series using ink, watercolour and tempera paint, which again played to the European obsession with celebrities and film stars, most of whom were American, but there was also considerable, if lesser, interest in Europe's own more glamorous stars of the screen. For reasons I can't imagine, his illustrations placed these well-known figures in any number of scenarios, which depicted one sort of mayhem or another, either out and about in public or in the studio. And although the intent was obviously comical in nature, some of the perils experienced by the central characters, such as scenes of combustion or dangerous collapse of scenery, were quite blatantly, if cheerfully, life-threatening. Whatever the thinking was behind this series of surreal, wildly comical images, they were immensely popular in France, and they were an enduring and popular fixture in the magazine with the readers. I also found some evidence which suggested that some of these at least found their way into the pages of the Italian magazines, and particularly Grand Hotel. And this is quite probable, as illustrators at this time and earlier were quite regularly reprinted in other countries to maximise the revenue generated. So the early 60s were evidently just as busy for Molino as the previous decades, although the last dated images I found created by him for La Domenica were dated 1966. And further searching clearly shows that following this others were taking his place with similar work, so it looks like that was the year or thereabouts that his 25-year association with the magazine ended. His bizarre but entertaining celebrity disasters were still popular in the pages of Festival, and he also featured regularly in the later 60s in Il Manello. Many of these were sport-themed, with a pronounced bias towards portraits of footballers alongside images of them in action on the pitch. Sources assert that by this time Molino had become somewhat tired of commercial work and was increasingly occupied with work as an artist. Although other than a couple of slightly surreal prints and paintings and this isolated sculpture, I didn't find a particularly large amount of evidence to show. And he certainly hadn't abandoned magazine work just yet, as his last covers for Grand Hotel, featuring uncaricatured portraits of yet more famous people, were published in the early 1980s. And it was at this time, and even a few years later, that he also created a collection of footballing and generally sporting-themed caricatures for the magazine Intrepido. And in the absence of any meaningful information about his later life, all I can tell you is that he died in Milan in 1997 at the age of 82. By the time he was done, Walter Molino had managed a remarkable 6-decade-long career, in which time he had created a vast amount of illustrated work. In cultural terms, I find myself somewhat baffled by various aspects of what he actually drew, and why it seems to have resonated so much with the Italian and French public. But having said that, there's plenty about what is supposedly my own culture and national heritage I'm equally puzzled by. Ultimately, all illustrators tend to have themes they return to again and again, and Molino did it with such flair, imagination and technical accomplishment. He is easily one of the more fascinating and distinctive subjects I've covered to date. And as always, here are a handful of others that I couldn't shoehorn into the video earlier, but that I couldn't bear to leave out.